This panel is on leveraging networks, sectors, and strategies for collective impact. So my name is Summer Lewis. I work as an international development consultant and educator with the consulting group True Roots. I'm based in Oaxaca, Mexico, and some of the work that I do is about providing tools and guidance to foundations and nonprofits to plan, monitor, and measure the impact of development and peace-building projects. And so a lot of the work that I do, and a lot of the work we'll be hearing about today, aligns completely and embodies the pillars of positive peace. So I first became familiar with IEP and their work as a Rotary Peace Fellow, then as a Global Peace Index Ambassador, and now as the coordinator for the Rotary and IEP Strategic Partnership. So we've mentioned this already. I won't go into detail because I know we're short on time. But Rotary is a very large organization. It's the world's largest service organization and has the mission of promoting peace and goodwill in the world. So this is via 1.2 million Rotarians, 33,000 clubs globally that fund, implement, and support development projects in 6 areas of focus. And these areas of focus align perfectly with the pillars of positive peace. So the new strategic partnership between Rotary and IEP is focused on education and training in positive peace via online learning, an online learning platform, via positive peace workshops, and an upcoming curriculum that's designed to help Rotarians implement their own workshops and training in positive peace around the world. So this particular partnership is just one example of efforts to spread the positive peace message and to provide tools for action. And we'll hear more today from our panelists about similar initiatives, similar actors, relationships, and alliances, or allies, as was mentioned this morning, that are joining forces to work towards collective impact and positive peace. So we'll start off with Steve Brown. He's a Rotary Foundation trustee from 2010 to 2014, and he's a member of the La Jolla Golden Triangle Rotary Club in California.
Thank you, Summer. I know there's some other Rotarians here as well. I joined Rotary in 1986. I didn't really know much about Rotary at all, but things have changed over the last 30-some years. And as Summer mentioned, I've become involved in some of the items in Rotary at the higher levels. And what's really been a lot of focus of my attention has been the Rotary Foundation, which is a companion organization to Rotary International. And the mission of the Rotary Foundation is to enable Rotarians to advance world understanding and peace through the improvement of health, the support of education, and the alleviation of poverty. It covers a lot of ground. We have 6 areas of focus under this: economic and community development, water and sanitation, basic education, disease prevention and treatment, maternal and child health, and peace and conflict prevention resolution. So we're focusing on the last area of focus. In 2002, Rotary launched a program that Summer participated in, which is the Rotary Peace Centers program. And at this time, it's evolved somewhat over time, but this time we have 5 sites where Rotary has peace centers that offer a master's degree in some peace-related field. So these are located, as we heard earlier this morning, at Bradford, England, Tokyo, Queensland, Uppsala, which is in Sweden, and Duke UNC. These are all master's degree programs. And then we have a certificate program in Chulalongkorn, Thailand, that's a 3-month program. And so we about 100 students a year, 50 in the certificate program, 50 in the master's program, enter these programs. And at this time, we have over 1,100 graduates in the program, alumni, with about 400 from the Chulalongkorn program, which is a newer program, the certificate program, and over 700 in the master's degree program. And we've done a pretty good job of keeping track of our alumni. Fortunately, this program started once email was around, so we're able to stay in touch pretty well. We find that over half of our graduates work for NGOs, governmental or UN-related agencies, and the balance are scattered in positions like research, teaching, the legal profession, law enforcement, journalism, etc. Over 70% of these live and work outside of North America. But in addition to that, Rotary has, so that program is fully funded by the Rotary Foundation through contributions from Rotarians. In addition to that, Rotary clubs and districts throughout the world can also support Rotary scholars in any of the 6 areas of focus, including peace and conflict prevention resolution, to study at the master's level. And to do that, Rotary clubs and districts need to put up money that gets matched by the Rotary Foundation. So to study at the Rotary Peace Centers, it's a very competitive process. To study under the second program, it's a matter of convincing a Rotary club or district that you're worthy of their donations. So Rotary's done a good job in getting a number of students into the peace programs around the world, but we looked at it a few years ago and said Rotary hadn't really done a very good job in doing things in the peace-related field besides having scholars go through the program. And so we've done a few things, but then when I was here in 2015 for this program, I met with Aubrey Fox afterwards, who was the director on the U.S. side of the Institute for Economics and Peace, and we talked about this, and he said, he would like to see if there's a way to get the Pillars of Positive Peace program in schools. And I say, my experience in schools, both in developing countries and in the U.S., it's really hard to break into the curriculum. It's for many, many reasons. But I said, there might be a way we could do something through the Rotary Network. And I mentioned to him that there's a Rotary-affiliated organization called Rotaract, which are people ages 19 to 29. And there's several thousand Rotaract clubs throughout the world. And I knew that Rotaract was strong in Uganda. So I said, how about if we explore trying to put together a program that involves Rotaract in Uganda? He said, well, let's see what we can do on that, and I would see if we could do this through a Rotary Foundation grant. So I got in touch with my contacts in Uganda, and we were able to, they were encouraging. They said, there's probably close to 80 Rotaract clubs in Uganda. There are several hundred Rotaract clubs, rather, several hundred Rotaractors throughout the country, so we can probably do this. So then for the funding for this, I got in touch with a Rotary district governor in the the San Francisco area. Leah's her name, and her whole theme for her year was peace. And so Leah got in touch with the clubs in her district and was basically able to put together the funding to support this program in Uganda. So in end of October, early November of last year in Kampala, Uganda, there were over 100 Rotaractors representing, I think, more than 60 clubs to have a workshop on developing and learning about and developing the concept of positive peace. Steve Killalay was there, David Hammond were there, and this was kind of a first. And so we used Rotary Peace Scholars to develop the curriculum, and we used Rotary Peace Scholars to help facilitate the whole discussion. And the idea was to educate them on positive peace, and these Rotaractors represented their own club. The idea was to come up with some ideas, go back to their club, share that idea, perhaps talk to their sponsor Rotary Club, and see what they could develop. So there was a second workshop that took place in March of this year, where a group of the Rotaractors came back, worked further on developing their proposals, and then in November of this next month, tomorrow. Anyway, there's going to be a program in November where these Rotaractors are going to come back and they're going to make presentations on a competitive basis for which projects look to be the best, and then there'll be some modest funding in the range of $500 or so to fund the proposals that go forward. And so part of the partnership with the Institute of Economics and Peace is to build on this concept and see if we can't do these in other places. Summer was involved in a kind of different group of demographic people doing this in Mexico City. There's talk about doing it in Colombia and different parts of the world, where the idea is we develop a template that can be modified for appropriate cultures and customs in order to use this idea using the Rotary Network and the development work by the Institute for this around the world. And so I think there's a lot of possibilities here, and I just want to close by making one additional comment, semi-related to this. I've spent a fair amount of time in the last 15 years doing volunteer work through Rotary in Afghanistan, having been there many times, and I can see potential for in a number of ways of using the positive peace concept through the networks we've established in Afghanistan for that. So I look forward to that possibility as well. So thank you.
I've never been a Rotarian, but I've got a couple of family members who have. And I didn't go to Stanford, I went to Berkeley, but hey, you know, go Bears. But I want to thank Steve Kalea and Michelle Breslauer for asking me to speak at the conference, and I've long admired their work around positive peace over the last half dozen years since we met. You know, I think that at the historical moment we're at now, a time of domestic political and geopolitical disruption, that we must rely more than ever on networks of people, organizations, private sector to step up and try to solve some of the world's most pressing problems, particularly problems around conflict prevention and resolution that are the key to peace. That in no way is an invitation or an excuse from me to back off from the fundamental essential role of government, but I do think that we need to face certain realities for at least the next several years as to where leadership and initiative and innovation are going to come. I don't think they're going to come from the United States government, sadly. I think they may come from other governments, but I do think that over the last couple of decades, we have learned that as critically important as governments and international institutions formed around governments are, that we also make tremendous progress when we come together through multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder approaches. Just think of the progress that's been made on climate the last couple of decades. Environmental NGOs that got the ball rolling, that captured the attention of policymakers in the US and around the world, that got the UN system to focus. But it's been the private sector, it's been the corporate world that has stepped up, and inconsistently, to be sure, but has stepped up for the most part. We're closer to the beginning than the end, but stepping up, and not least corporate America making renewed commitments in the wake of the very unfortunate decision to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement. I can look around the whole landscape of policy initiatives, and one's focused particularly on conflict prevention and resolution, focused on improving governance, reducing corruption, protecting and promoting human rights, all the critical elements that go to peace, and not just peace, but democracy, human rights, and basic freedoms. And when I look at that landscape, I really am impressed by the willingness and creativity and innovation that are embodied in a whole set of multi-stakeholder initiatives. And this is an area that I've been particularly involved with since I was at the State Department, and ever since in the NGO and the corporate worlds alike. I'm thinking of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative that brings together governments, companies, and civil society, NGOs, to try to reduce corruption related to the extractive sectors, oil, gas, and mining, that has been such a scourge, the so-called resource curse that has enriched elites and impoverished the vast majority of people in a range of countries, and also engendered violent conflict. I'm thinking of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights and the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Forces, that two parallel initiatives that together get security forces, public, military, and police security forces, private security forces, to try to be more respectful of human rights as they operate alongside the private sector around the world. I'm thinking of another one I've been involved with, the Global Network Initiative, which works with some of the giants of the technology industry here in Silicon Valley and globally now to promote internet freedom, transparency, and accountability around surveillance and censorship. And this too goes to peace, to the basic exercise of freedom of expression that civil society depends on, the right to privacy in the face of the massive walls of surveillance that we see. And this Global Network Initiative of ours, GNI for short, also works on issues such as trying to prevent or mitigate shutdowns of networks in countries that stifle civil society, stifle business opportunity, and aid repression and corruption. We've seen that all over the world in recent years. I'm sad to say in Africa, in even in the Middle East, in South and Southeast Asia. So we're seeing progress through these so-called multi-stakeholder initiatives, and I can't emphasize enough, as one who's been a co-founder and architect of several of them, that these are no substitutes for government, for international institutions. They can complement but not supplant the essential role that government has to play. But we're seeing less of that initiative and innovation now, at least, particularly from the United States, which has been, and I am an American exceptionalist and proud of it, as well as an internationalist. We've been exceptional in this country in terms of our willingness to be the primary architect and guarantor of the international legal order that has served the world on the whole, I think, better than worse in the last 3/4 of a century, that's now under attack. Speaking of attack, and warming to my final theme here, which gets us back into the conflict arena and to peace, there's a war out there, a war against civil society all around the world. Attacks on human rights defenders, on land and environmental defenders, on indigenous community leaders, on anti-corruption activists, on independent bloggers, on journalists, on women activists, on LGBTI activists, trade unionists not least, all around the world. And these attacks on civil society are coming not just from repressive authoritarian governments, but sad to say from some of the new hybrid authoritarian democracies that we see, Hungary and Turkey are two that come to mind in particular. And what is encouraging is the willingness of the private sector, of companies, to actually come to the aid of human rights defenders, trade unions, and civil society. One wouldn't think it necessarily, but it's beginning to happen. I'm part of a new initiative called the Business Network for Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders, which is trying to encourage and coordinate efforts around the world for companies to be able to work alongside NGOs, local communities, human rights defenders, to stand up for the basic freedom of expression, right to assembly, right to protest, basic trade union rights. And these are not obvious stances for companies to take, particularly when some of these very same groups are often protesting against companies. But I'm really encouraged when I see corporations, as they have in the apparel sector, stand up for a decent minimum wage in the garment sector in Cambodia. I'm encouraged when I see also in Southeast Asia companies beginning to speak out against the repression of the Muslim Rohingya minority. I'm encouraged when I see web companies, including a couple based here in Silicon Valley, who got together and agreed that they would not bid on particularly invasive web filtering of business opportunities in Pakistan, in coordination with local Pakistani civil society, urging them to stay away. So my point in wrapping up here is that at a time of disruption, a time of repression, a time of insecurity, instability everywhere we look, we can't dismiss government. We've got to restore democracy. We still have a democracy in this country. We're in battle, we're in turmoil now, but we've got to work with civil society. We've got to build these bridges among the business world, civil society, NGOs, trade unions, activists of every sort, and recognize the fundamental common interests that we have, not least in positive peace. Thank you.
So I am extremely excited to be here representing the Transforming Peacebuilding team at Humanity United. HU is one of the Omidyar Group philanthropies. The Omidyars, PR Omidyar specifically, established eBay. So we have deep roots here in Silicon Valley. And it's really wonderful to be back here at Stanford in particular. So a couple of years ago, working very closely with IEP, we co-sponsored the first Positive Peace Conference, and it has been hugely influential in driving the new direction for our work. I will say that our strategy has shifted significantly since the last conference, and as I was reflecting on this panel, I thought that it would be valuable for me to walk all of you through how our strategy has evolved. We have moved pretty firmly from the atrocity prevention space into the peace-building space, and in doing so, we've really reflected on what constitute healthy societies and how we as funders can help to build healthy societies. The name of our program is very explicit in its purpose. It is Transforming Peace Building. We're not burying the lead there. Our agenda is intended to transform the peace building system from the bottom up and from the top down. We hope that transforming peace building policy and practice will lead to better outcomes on the ground, and we want to create within individual countries and across the world sustainable and inclusive peace. It's been very widely acknowledged in our field that the peace-building system is fundamentally broken. This is agreed upon by grassroots peace builders all the way up to the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, with the Sustaining Peace Agenda. And we at HU agree with a very familiar refrain in our field. The system is set up to respond top-down to crises rather than building resilient societies from the ground up. So in 2014, we at HU sought to transform the peace-building system, and we applied the systems practice that was discussed in great length during the first panel here at this conference. The use of systems thinking was a very radical change in approach for HU. It required us to return to the basics, to challenge our assumptions, and to become open-minded to new approaches. And we entered a very intensive period of consultation with internal and external stakeholders. We piloted emergency responses in Burundi and the Central African Republic. We made visits to 6 African countries, all of which were identified as being at mid-level risk of atrocities or mass violence. And there we met with multilateral institutions, bilateral donors, civil society, governments, INGOs. And we also just engaged in a really broad study of the comparative advantages of different approaches to peace building. So through this really intensive consultation process, we spent an entire year building out a systems map. And through this systems map, we identified some central and very problematic dynamics in the peace building system. First of all, and all of you know this well, interventions are heavily projectized. We incentivize the creation of projects as a field. Likewise, interventions are heavily siloed. We as peace-building actors do not work together. We don't work well with development actors or humanitarian actors. And everything we do is driven first and foremost by donor demands rather than an assessment of really what works on the ground. And in this analysis, we also came to the conclusion that domestic actors, even though they are the ones that are caught up in conflict, are heavily marginalized and they're not given agency to build peace within their own societies. So, in the same way that positive peace reframes the narrative, we started in our systems mapping process to reframe our own narrative. So when you create a systems map, you look at bright spots, and bright spots are defined as opportunities for leverage. The idea here is to put the emphasis on resiliencies rather than risks. And it's also to recognize that in the case of peace building, as the other 2 panelists just said, we need to use a whole of society approach. So we commissioned some research around the role of private sector actors, and we concluded that they do have unique leverage in certain contexts, though their approaches can't be cookie cutter. We engaged in a year-long emergency response in Burundi, and we noticed that it was social movements that were harnessing the power of the people. But we as funders and we as the DC policy community didn't really know how to deal with social movements. And since then, we at HU have started to engage in a heavy study of social movements, and we've even funded the creation of a training hub in Nairobi to train trainers, to train activists, how to train other activists in social movement methodology. And finally, in this period of research, we were really driven by the tenet that silos need to be torn down and that there are silos between peace-building actors themselves. So we right now are funding a study of collective impact models, how peace builders collaborate together on the ground, and we hope to release those case studies later this year. So this is a lot of learning I have just gone over, and that was only stage 1. We actually spent this last year and the last summer in particular building out our strategy. And our strategy as it stands currently has 2 pillars. The first is called domestically driven peace, and the second one is called demand for reform. So the first pillar, domestically driven peace, we've laid the groundwork for the creation of platforms in 2 focus countries, Mali, and Zimbabwe. So our hope is that through engagement in Mali and Zimbabwe over 10 years, we're making 10-year investments, we are going to develop alternative approaches of what works that we can feed up to the sector level. And in working with domestic actors in Mali and Zimbabwe, our understanding of the role that they played in the system has also developed more nuance. We always thought that domestic actors needed more capacity, but we thought that simply putting financial resources in their direction would be sufficient, and that that would allow them to mobilize and to create change. But through our engagement in Mali and Zimbabwe, we have seen that these domestic actors are engaging in highly polarized and fractured contexts. And there's really a lack of inclusive spaces for groups to come together for collective problem solving and action. In both of these contexts, and this is sort of an assessment of other countries that are similar in terms of sort of their economic, political, and social situations, there's really minimal social capital. So the goal of our programs in Mali and Zimbabwe is to increase social capital, first amongst the stakeholders we're engaging with, and then later at the country level. In both Mali and Zimbabwe, we're piloting 2 new methodologies, and I'm happy to answer questions about both of these during the question and answer session. In brief, in Zimbabwe, we're creating what's called a social lab. A social lab is a multi-year process that brings together disparate groups to solve a challenge. A challenge is generally a proxy. It's something that's politically neutral. In the case of Zimbabwe, it's a highly politically polarized context where the opposition doesn't speak to the ruling party. So we're hoping that we can bring people together across political lines. And in Mali, we are collaborating with an NGO connected to Interpeace on a methodology called systemic action research. And we're working in 6 communities across the country, trying to, at base, and it's, again, a multi-year commitment, promote dialogue. And, one of the central questions is, we're in year 1 of 10-year programs in both of these countries, and we still are not certain how we're going to determine the effectiveness of our approaches. And we have even found ourselves pulling the positive peace index from our shelves and saying, okay, we may not find that the positive peace indicators change or shift in the first year of our engagement or the second, but the hope is that in building social capital, we'll see knock-on effects 10 or 20 years down the line. And as I mentioned, we have a second strand to our strategy. It's called Demand for Reform. And in this one, we're capitalizing on what is a clear and demonstrated appetite for reform amongst stakeholders at all levels within our system. So we have spent months grappling with the key question about the research policy gap. We have very compelling evidence that peacebuilding works. We have compelling evidence that peacebuilding approaches are more effective than militarized approaches, but we haven't seen much in the way of uptake by major institutions. So we spent this summer in preparation for our board meeting really probing that question. Why are there counterproductive policies and practices of institutions that should be leading the charge in peacebuilding? What are the entrenched incentive structures at play? And again, we see structural impediments to effective peacebuilding within donor governments, within large INGOs, and within the UN replicating themselves on down through the system. Through this period of really intensive study of the system, we came to understand that risk aversion drives business as usual, a log frame mindset prevents genuine partnership, and a flawed evaluation paradigm puts a premium on metrics rather than long-term social change. So in other words, as I said, the name of our program is Transforming Peacebuilding, and we understand now much more than ever how truly ambitious and difficult this agenda is. But as I said before, we've seen some really encouraging signs of momentum in the system. We've seen some early voices start to mobilize into networks, as Bennett just mentioned, and we're trying now to explore how to identify and harness change agents to shift the practices of key influencers. So we're in a process of determining who are the key influencers in the system. Who are those institutions that have the financial, the intellectual, and the social capital to create change throughout the system? Which institutions have the political will to change their management, their programming, their evaluation, and most importantly, their funding patterns? so we are on the cusp of embarking on a baseline survey of attitudes and norms in the peace-building system. And part of this survey will help us determine the parameters of the system. It'll help us determine who the key actors are. We'd love for all of you to be involved, so you will most likely be surveyed. And we are also embarking on a really exciting process called Transformative Scenario Planning. And we're working with a Danish collaborator to bring together multi-stakeholder roundtables at the global level to examine how the gaps in the international architecture are manifested at the country level. And part of transformative scenario planning is you don't only look at the system as it is, you sort of imagine the system as it could be and the different scenarios around how to bring the system to where it should be. So I'll say right now we have a provisional theory of change, which I'll sum up very simply. It's that evidence plus shifts in the incentive structures will lead to change. But we have a huge number of unanswered questions. One that I pointed to earlier, how do we prove that domestically driven peace leads to increased resiliency in societies? How do we prove that the methodologies that we've used in Mali and Zimbabwe should be joined by other actors in the field? How do we bring other institutions to the table? How do we scale them up? How do we create domestically driven platforms throughout the peace-building field, not only led by HU? And then we've also remarked that as we're building out our demand for reform strategy, we're very much driven by changing the funding flows and patterns within and amongst the lead institutions. So a couple weeks ago, I was at a roundtable with the lead author on the UN side of the UN World Bank report on conflict prevention. And one of the points that he made was that it's incredibly important to bring the sustaining peace agenda down to the ground. It's ultimately the citizens that determine legislative priorities, the citizens that determine the government's priorities, what funding goes to multilateral institutions, and there really needs to be a push at the hyper-local level for a peace agenda. So we've been involved in early discussions around a global peace campaign. We're not sure if it'll take off. We're not sure if it has traction. But we do think it's important to galvanize public sentiment and to involve the public in these discussions, even simply by shifting the media narratives around peace. So I will leave you now. I have gone far beyond my time, I know, with a question that, as I look around the room, that we've been grappling with at HU. We all play different roles within the system, and how is it that we can work together within our respective lanes to push this agenda forward? Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Summer, and thank you everyone on the panel. We're so excited to be here. So it really all begins with us with a question. How do you mobilize people, especially youth, around peace? That was really the question that started it all for us. How do you mobilize the masses around peace? How do you make peace popular? So my background is in awareness campaigns. So anti-child abuse, anti-domestic abuse, those kind of things. And when I came to Search, the more I learned about peace building, the more I'm like, wow, my generation would totally be behind peace building. We're just not branding this right. You see, when we talk about peace, most of the time, the only youth we're attracting are youth that are already interested in peace building, which unfortunately is a pretty small little sliver of the youth pie. So we're missing the activist youth. We're missing the youth that are vulnerable to being recruited into gangs if they're being marginalized or socioeconomic. And we're missing the youth that are just bored, that don't know what their passion is. But do you know who is really successful at recruiting youth? Violent and extremist groups. You see, today in the world, most of the times youth are treated as either victims or villains when it comes to violence. And I mean, it is true that we're affected most by violence. It is a leading cause of death for ages 15 to 25. But even though it affects us most, we have the least say and the least power when it comes to these decisions that are made around us. And I get it. There's this sense that you have to earn your spot at the table. But unfortunately, a lot of young people have some great ideas, and it leaves youth feeling frustrated and helpless. And then what happens is you have a violent extremist that comes in, puts a weapon in your hand, and says, you never have to feel helpless again. They'll pay attention to you now. So what if we could give youth that sense of connection, that sense of belonging, that sense of power, where they truly feel like they matter? What if we could make youth today heroes, bona fide heroes? So what we've done with Battle for Humanity is we've taken the modern archetype of a hero. So, the hero that you see in Marvel's Avengers, in Call of Duty, in Assassin's Creed, and we combined it with everything you spend time on today. So, social media, gaming. We've actually worked with UPenn's Positive Psychology Center on a positive gamification framework, and of course, their phones, and that's really where Battle was born. So I'm actually cheating today. I actually have a visual. I know, I don't think anyone else has visuals today, so I totally feel like I'm cheating. So we're just gonna play. So this is the app, just to give you kind of idea of how this works. So Battle for Humanity is a social movement and a game on a mobile app. So this is how it works. You sign up for the app, they download it, you sign the pledge to join, and you get your own profile page. Then each profile page, you can actually choose missions that help you fight violence, hate, and injustice in real life. So this is real life, not video game, this is real life. So our missions are broken up into get smart, get loud, get bold. So it could be anything as, we might send you out, get smart, we might send you out to interview both sides, to do research, to learn actually what's going on. Get loud, we might ask you to tweet a celebrity or start a pledge on your college campus against sexual-based violence. Get bold is actually go out and do something. So bring your community together with a block party, mentor youth after school, start a clothing drive for refugees in your house of worship. So you pick an activity that you'd like to do on the app, and then you go out and do it, and users gain points by uploading images of themselves completing these missions, and then it gives them a battle filter over it. So you get a battle filter, you get pre-populated hashtags that then users can share on all of their social media sites. So we like to say, this is really corny, but I'm going to say it anyways, that other filters make you look good, but battle filters make you do good. I'm sorry, I'm a comms person. I had to get it out there. So it's really exciting. So within the app, we'll have this interactive map so you can see other youth in your area, points, how many points they've earned by doing, good, positive acts. And we'll also, a lot of it is focused on the ground, so there are actions that youth can take in their community and skills that they can learn to build in their community. But we'll also unite all the users and players for Battle for Humanity around certain events. So let's say there's an event like Charlottesville, or there's a terrorist attack. We'll send out special push notifications for you have a mission that you have 24 hours to complete. And so we'll kind of, change your Facebook profile picture or whatever we'll do, and we'll unite everyone around the app. So at the end of the day, our goal is to take users and youth on a hero journey that builds their confidence and their skills to overcome difference and use conflict as an opportunity to create positive change. And right now, we want this to be a platform for all of us to use. So we're already working with other partner organizations to co-develop missions together, and so that we have a lot of other people's type of approach on the app. And we'll also be able to, expose young people to all these other organizations that are doing really important work. And I also, with the positive peace pillars, here's our hero journey. So this is really cool. I don't have time to jump into it really far, but I think this is really cool. This is totally nerding out. So this is basically our hero journey. And so this is the journey we want to take youth on. These are our 3 core competencies that we want to build. So first is empathy, humanization. So we start youth asking why. Why do they feel that way? Why are they angry? Why am I angry? I respect others. To self-efficacy. Start feeling like, I am powerful. I have a choice. I am a peace builder. I find my identity in this. I can convene others. And then finally, to transformative action. So, you know what? I can transform relationships. I can transform society. So that's the hero journey that we're hoping to take youth on. And, you know, looking closely at the positive peace pillars, I feel like there's 3 key ways that battle can support the positive peace pillars. The first is increasing knowledge around the pillars. So with our Get Smart missions, we can have it so that users start to understand how things like inequality and free flow of information affect them and their communities. Second, actually creating concrete activities for youth to do that affect the positive peace pillars. So obviously around acceptance of rights, so respecting others, but also building human capital. Building youth that are leaders and that have the skills to address conflict that arises in positive, constructive ways that actually solve the problem. And then the third way is, one of the really cool things about this app is we'll have the ability to both test missions and test what is really engaging youth and getting them out there and getting them going, and we'll have amazing data. I mean, with the app, we'll be able to see the geolocation of where these activities are taking place. We'll have their gender, we'll have their age, and so one, we can figure out what's actually working. So like what are youth clicking on? We have all these different indicators that we'll be looking at, but we can also start to make a real case for why this kind of work, why peace building is so important. It's really hard to prove a negative, right? But with this, like, we'll actually have markers of like, these are where positive events are going on. We'll even have markers of, eventually youth turning in, like, I actually de-escalated a conflict, and they can actually turn those in for points. So when is this coming out? So it's actually not out yet, but in the next month, we'll be releasing our first beta here in the US, in Nigeria, and in Europe, but it's global. The first one's English speaking, but we're really excited to see how this goes forward and to work with any and all of you guys with this project. So yeah, thank you.
I'm very intrigued by the app, and I think Rotary International is a great network to tap into and maybe enrich the data and the activities of the map. We have a large population of Rotary actors. That's the youth component of Rotary International. And I think that would be a great way to integrate into the map, like this network and that kind of thinking. So I wonder if you would be open to that and your comments.
Yes. Affirmative. Yes, absolutely. This is a really cool thing about the app is, like I said, we could co-create missions together and put missions and say, this mission created by Rotary. And we're totally willing to do that because, like I said, we agree that we've been in silos for too long, and we know that a lot of people have been talking about gamifying, peace building and giving activities for you. So we're very open to that. I think we also have several other organizations that are looking to plug in their networks. One of the big problems is that we have so many grants that are only 18 months. And so, we get these grants, they're 18 months, we get youth all excited and ready, and then we're gone, right? And so this is a way for them to plug in their youth. I know Global Citizen is interested in plugging in their alumni network. We're in talks with the International Federation of the Red Cross. Absolutely, we're very open to partnerships and learning from each other as well.
My question is sort of for Bennett, but also the whole panel. And I'm glad that you raised climate change. So because of Stanley, we actually got to spend a lot of time with the climate change advocates about 2 weeks ago. And I was asking all of them, how did you get to the 2 degrees Celsius goal? Like, what did it take and when did you get there? And what was the chronology of events? And I think that in the peace building field, one of the challenges is that we don't have a tangible goal that we as a field globally are all rallied around. And with this legislation that I mentioned on the last panel, when I've been going to Congress trying to compare this to HIV/AIDS in terms of how it's structured, they say, well, you guys don't have nearly the movement that they had. To which, I think we would argue, well, there are thousands and thousands of peace building organizations in the world. So I'm curious your thoughts and on EITI, which and all those other issues. Yeah. Those solved a very specific goal that we could all clearly articulate. So I'm curious what you think, like, what should that goal be? Could we get there as a field of a specific, like, we're going to have, you know, we're trying to halve global violence or something like that?
Great question. You know, the climate goal of reducing, you know, 2 degrees Celsius is a rare one in terms of it being not just tangible but quantifiable. It's much harder on social issues, you know, that don't have necessarily have hard metrics around them. That said, I can think of a couple of examples that are inspiring. One that I've been quite involved with is with Global Witness, whose advisory board I chair, and it was Global Witness that coined the phrase, publish what you pay, which in turn became the cornerstone of the EITI you just mentioned, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. It's really tough to reduce these great causes and campaigns to a bumper sticker phrase, but that's a superb example, a rare example of one where we have, although thinking about publish what you pay, it's a clear declarative statement, but it's not an outcome, it's a process. So it doesn't get us all the way there. Ultimately, when it comes to publish what you pay, what we want to be able to do is have civil society empowered to hold governments accountable for not only the revenue they collect, but how they then expend that revenue, hopefully in the public interest through accountable, transparent government. I'll give you a smaller example, also involved with, not one I'm involved with, but somebody who serves with me on the Global Witness Board, who's won a Skull Award for her work in this area, and that's the Girls Not Brides campaign that some of you are probably also aware of. The person who's in charge of this is Mabel Van Orange, who's a Dutch woman who used to run the Elders. And she very cleverly and passionately also, in this case, has taken a very complex social, cultural, and religious problem that's prevalent in all too many societies and countries around the world and reduced it to a single slogan, phrase, and NGO movement that she spearheads now globally with a lot of local partners around the world. So the point is that it's harder, I think, once you get past something like climate, where we've got the scientific basis, we know what we're aiming towards with a high degree of precision. But it is possible. Those are 2 examples there on the social side, and certainly there are many, many others. But when it comes to peace and conflict resolution, I think that we've learned the hard way that simply stopping the killing, ending the conflict, isn't the end of story. It's certainly the most critical part of it, but ultimately what we're trying to do also is build decent, just, fair, tolerant societies that will, on their own efforts, without my friend Mark Schneider's former organization, the International Crisis Group, have to rely on outside support where that kind of peace and justice can be self-sustaining, and that takes a lot more than simply ending conflicts, although it's hard to think of anything more important than any of us can do than to end, or for that matter, prevent conflicts. But I really love your question because it gets at this tension or balance between, or really usually more often than not, disconnect between the great problems that we perceive and then how we define and measure solutions and how we organize and campaign around them. It's a really, really tough nut to crack, so thanks for the question.
My question is at you. I wonder if you've included religious players in your analysis and methodology, given that they can be going either way, peacefully or violently. So I'm curious what your thoughts on that.
So as I said, our strategy has 2 pillars. The first one is domestically driven peace. The second one is demand for reform. I work on the demand for reform side of our strategy, and that's where it starts to get a little wonky when I was talking about the key influencers, how we imagine the system being transformed, and that's the work with policymakers. And in that analysis, we're still in a very preliminary phase. So we will certainly be surveying religious actors. We'll be taking them into account when we're better doing what in systems this practice is called systems sensing, but we're not really to the point where we're directly engaging with religious actors. That being said, we are much further along on our domestically driven peace work in Mali and Zimbabwe. And in both Mali and Zimbabwe, religion is hugely important. Obviously, in Mali there is it's gross simplification, but a religious dimension to the conflict there, that, there has been a CVE frame that has been put on all responses, and we are, working against that very frame by engaging with local communities. In the case of Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe, as I mentioned, is a hugely polarized society, and with minimal civic space, minimal opportunities. Civil society is actually quite robust, but the risks for civil society are huge. And one way that there has been an opening is for evangelical leaders and the churches to either rise up against the state, to ally themselves with the state, to create their own movements that have no connection to what's happening with the state. So in any work in Zimbabwe, you need to take into account religious actors because they're hugely important and hugely influential. And there was a huge burst of movement building over the past couple of years in Zimbabwe, and some of that was led by the church itself. So that certainly plays into our analysis.
Can you speak a little bit more about, all right, let me ask the question a little differently. Do you, in your transformation peace process, have what's the buy-in between governmental leaders and civil society grassroots work?
So that's a very difficult question to answer because we actually just had our meeting, an inception meeting for the partner organizations and HU related to this process last week. So there's a process called Transformative Scenario Planning, which grew out of scenario planning within corporations like Shell, for example, and the business school at Oxford are known for their work around scenario planning. And there have been a number of scenario planning processes, most recently with the OAS around drug policy in Latin America. There's been a planning process around different healthcare scenarios in the US as far as how the Affordable Care Act plays out. So we're looking at these processes and seeing, where they have relevance in the peace building space. So the idea for the transformative scenario process is basically the international architecture the gaps in the international architecture are manifested in problems at the country level within, for example, UN country headquarters. So we would be convening a group of about 40 people, a global multi-stakeholder platform that would include the grassroots as well as the highest levels of UN elites, and take them through over the course of a year, planning scenarios for how the system could change. And that's still very vague and high level because we are just embarking on the process.
I'm Joyce Anastasia. Carrie, I'm curious how the two countries were selected, and does that create any kind of distancing by other supporters because those two and not others were selected?
Well, I was not at HU for the country selection process. It took place over the course of a couple of years, and it was a very intensive process that grew out of our engagement in the crises in CAR and Burundi. My team members went into 6 different countries, as I said, on the African continent, each at mid-level in terms of their risk of mass violence, and did analysis of opportunities and gaps. And in that process, we decided to focus on Mali, Zimbabwe, and Kenya. The idea being that we would test a different methodology in each country. In the case of Zimbabwe, you have sort of a unipolar system in which the government or the political party is the state is the political party. In Mali, you have a plethora of armed groups, more and more sprouting up, so it's very kind of multipolar. So we wanted to choose two different countries that had two very different political situations and were dealt with very differently by the international community, and that they were conducive to testing the two methodologies. The first one, the social lab in Zimbabwe, the second one, systemic action research in Mali, that we're exploring. The reason that we had chosen Kenya as a third country is because we had seen that the private sector played a hugely important role in stemming election violence in Kenya in 2013. And we were hoping that Kenya could become a sort of long-term private sector case study. But over time, it became clear that the space in Kenya is very full in terms of, other funders, very robust civil society. It made sense to double down on Mali and Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe in particular has not really been on the international community's radar in the way that it should be.
Hi. I'm trying to connect Bennett, Carrie, and Jessica here. If we look at the overall goal to transform peace building into the direction of something like elicitive conflict transformation, as John Paul Lederach or Wolfgang Dietrich call it, then we need, of course, to have a broader picture. We need to understand the different energies at play, transform the negative energies, initially negative energies of a conflict into positive energies. And I think the app, Jessica, that you introduced is fabulous. I mean, that's just amazing. And that brings me to Bennett. If you talked about the business networks. I think there is tremendous potential here for the three of you to collaborate, to bring in companies to promote the apps, to bring this whole idea of peace building to a new level. But at the time when I worked at Nokia a few years ago, there were some, by far not as sophisticated, but I would say still similar initiatives at Nokia, and by the time that Microsoft overtook the mobile phone business of Nokia, these initiatives may have been taken over by Microsoft. So I don't know if you have any contacts to Microsoft. I don't, but perhaps there are into that direction some projects or programs still existing that might be of interest. Thank you.
Awesome. So all I wanted to add to that was, so what I didn't talk about in the app was the sustainable business model that we have with this. And so part of the sustainable business model is engaging big corporate brands to help fund this. And so the idea would be in two core places. So with the we're going to have a marketplace in the app, so where you can spend points. So let's say, you get 500 points and you get $50 off your next Amazon purchase. Or, you can buy one, get one free, you get a promo code for Starbucks or something like that. No, I haven't talked to either one. And secondly, because there's so many brands that are having trouble with the young millennial consumer, for a lot of different reasons. We're ad blind, we just don't see them. Doesn't matter. We have TiVo. We see them. We don't see ads. And so there's a lot of brands that are really struggling to engage positively with millennials, and they know that millennials care about their about the social impact of their brands. 91% of millennials in the U.S. said they would actually switch brands to a comparable brand that supported a cause they cared about. And so we're also thinking about co-branding missions. So imagine, let's say Nike has a new shoe coming out, and so we'll co-brand a Just Do It mission with them, and let's say the mission is starting a running club in your gentrified neighborhood, and we'd get a certain amount per click, per view, per completion. And so that's one of the ways that we're thinking about how to make this sustainable and to work with corporations in the private sector more, and so we don't have to depend on grants that have a really short lifespan. So, but yeah, thank you.
Well, I would just add very quickly that I appreciate the question and also the examples of Nokia and Microsoft, and indeed those are two companies among others that mostly quietly behind the scenes are helpful to civil society actors, to NGOs, to individual human rights defenders, to bloggers. Indeed, Microsoft is part of this emerging business network for civic freedom and human rights defenders that I'm working with. That's not really fully publicly launched yet, but they're being helpful behind the scenes in certain countries, as are other companies. Sometimes it's trying to intervene behind the scenes to protect an at-risk or threatened well-known blogger in a political context. Sometimes it's furnishing software packages or equipping hardware people, NGOs that wouldn't be able to afford them otherwise, that are doing important human rights related work. So there are different ways that internet and telco and mobile communications companies can help. And of course, you alluded in your question to the kinds of apps that also can empower workers' rights. And there are such apps that provide sort of hotline and grievance mechanisms for workers in low-wage supply chain workplaces, often without any or if present weak trade unions, and therefore have to rely on these digital tools, which actually come in quite handy, although there's training required as well as cost involved to make them actually effective. But I really appreciate the question. I'll just mention in closing on this point, I'm involved in yet another initiative that has also not yet been announced, although the sneak preview is that there'll be a brief announcement in London on November 15th and then a full one in the spring. But there's an emerging network of tech companies across internet, telco, and mobile communications that are going to be working together to combat human trafficking and various forms of modern slavery. The working name of the initiative thus far is Tech Against Slavery, and I will be on the call with them at 6 o'clock Pacific tomorrow morning with people in London trying to get this thing together. So watch that space. There'll be announcements made in the coming months. But these are examples, I mean, going back to my theme of how the private sector can and does step up in some circumstances that we're seeing around the world, where civil society and civic freedoms are under attack, human rights is under attack. And I think it's too easy for a lot of us, particularly those of us who may have been shaped by the 1960s and 70s, to always think that big corporations are evil. And by God, they've done a lot of ill in the world. I've spent much of my career working on corporate accountability, but it's really quite encouraging to see so many growing examples now where companies, for various reasons, sometimes because pressure is brought to bear by media and NGOs, sometimes because there's a compelling business case and even market opportunity, are now taking the place or working alongside governments, whether it's fighting corruption or diminishing climate change's effects, or even in this nitty-gritty tough work behind the scenes of trying to protect human rights defenders. So we can't rely on companies to do this, but we can certainly ask and implore, and I'm really encouraged by these kinds of examples.
Okay, so we're pretty much at time, and we'll go ahead and wrap up, but I think that there may be some time later on at dinner to also connect with our panelists. Thank you so much to all of you. Just quickly, this morning when I opened my phone, I get notifications from a network for Grateful Living, if anyone's interested in joining that. And the word for the day was from Desmond Tutu, and it said, "My humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together." And I thought that was a beautiful start to the day in thinking about this panel, and our panelists have definitely embodied that theme. So thank you so much.